Good afternoon and welcome to the CERIAS Security Seminar from Purdue University. Our speaker today is Greg Stevens from the MITRE Corporation. His talk today is entitled Proactive Detection of Malicious Insiders Through Information Use Patterns. Greg.
Well, so thank you for inviting me out here. I'm actually going to try to talk to you about two bits of research that MITRE has done through our internal research and development program, and in collaboration with the Institute for Information Infrastructure Protection, both involving detecting or better understanding the insider threat. So, insider threat's an overloaded term. Many people mean different things when they say it. They can mean insiders hacking, those kinds of things. One particular type of insider that we're particularly worried about are people who don't need to hack. They already have all the privileges they need on their network. They're trusted insiders who are using their legitimate privileges for illegitimate purposes. And they're kind of problematic because if you think about it, the access controls, really don't stop them. They're already inside the circle of trust, if you will, that access controls represent. And furthermore, you have traditional cyber detection methods, things like log auditing and intrusion detection. But if you think about them, those kinds of activities are looking for attempted or successful rule-breaking behavior. These people don't need to break rules. They just use their privileges to gather what they need. There's also another type of tool. I call them focus observation tools. Some people call them, there's things called network forensics analysis tools, data loss prevention tools. And those things can be turned up to monitor everything the user does in terms of how they interact with information. However, they really produce so much information that if you're in a large organization, you really cannot effectively use them except for in a forensic, once you figure out you've lost data from a malicious insider, to go back through and figure out how bad was it. So if you think about it, when you're trying to monitor from an enterprise perspective, you may be monitoring thousands or tens of thousands or even more users. So what we really wanted to build was something that could address things on those scales with a manageable level of effort for an average organization. So one of a couple key aspects to what we did in terms of detection, we felt that certainly you can potentially catch the malicious insider when they try to exfiltrate or take the data outside the organization. But that's kind of the last step in their plan. Once they've done that, they've accomplished their goal pretty much. Much preferable to that would be to try to catch them when they actually have to gather the information that they ultimately want to take with them. So we believe that's actually a point of vulnerability because they have to get at that information first, and that happens over a period of time. And another thing that can help us in this approach is focusing. If we're worried about the information being stolen, focus on how users are interacting with the information. How do they browse? How do they search? What do they download? What do they print? These are all things that can help you at least pick up the signal of what's going on and help you begin to spot what's interesting. However, when you look at how people use information, the vast majority of the behavior is going to be benign. So to try to differentiate the potentially malicious from benign, we leverage what we think of as the home field advantage. We know things about our insiders, the people in our organizations, and we know things about the data that they interact with. When you take the context and superimpose it upon the information use behavior, we believe you can spot patterns of misuse. So to test these concepts, we built a system that we called ELICIT. It stands for Exploit Latent Information to Counter Insider Threats. And what I'm going to do is just give you a quick overview of the system itself in this slide, and then we'll talk through the different pieces. But the way the system processes data is shown on the bottom. You go from packets to events to alerts to threats. When you analyze the data, you go the exact, when an analyst looks at it, they go the exact opposite. So let's actually, I'll describe it from left to right in this and subsequent slides, and then we'll talk about how we actually tested this idea and the results. So we did build a network sensor that looked at how people use information. We'll talk about that in the next slide. We also collected context about people and the information that they interact with. By combining those two forms of data together, we built a number of detectors. And these detectors, when reporting thresholds are exceeded, and they calculate a score each day for every user that has activity, they produce alerts. Now, if you kind of left things at that point, you would still, if you're monitoring a large enterprise, you certainly have too many events to look at everything. And even with the alerts, you have too many alerts to look through every alert. I don't know if any of you have ever looked at an output of Snort or something like that for a large network, but there's a lot of data flying at you, and it's no different in this context. You really need, an analyst to effectively make use of this really needs an ability to prioritize what they did. And to do that, we use the Bayesian inference network and to basically, based on degrees of belief, to produce a probability between 0 and 1 that that you have a malicious insider given the behavior or the alerts that you have seen. Ultimately, that gets fed into a user interface, and when an analyst analyzes it, they work from threats down to alerts that produce the threat score down to events that produce the alerts. So let's go into some of this now. In terms of, for the network sensor, we actually, for the research, we captured files on a real network. We actually used MITRE's intranet. We wanted to use a real-world environment. That's been a real problem in general in intrusion detection, is coming up with realistic data sets. So we wanted to at least have some background data that was real in nature and of a large enough scale so we could tell whether our approach had any ability to kind of reduce that signal to noise ratio. So we built some protocol decoders that basically used, at the time, Ethereal, now Wireshark, to dissect and filter frames that we cared about. And then we, on top of that, had added some second stage processing that was based on some object-oriented Perl modules that we had written. But basically, you take the events between client and server, say for protocols tied to information use, things like HTTP, FTP, SMTP, and a Microsoft Windows Server message block, which is what Microsoft does: printing, file sharing, remote procedure calls, all sorts of interesting things. But the information use that happens over these protocols are things that we care about, and we abstract out the bits and bytes and get to what are people using with the information. So we also, when we see signs of who the user is, because to really apply context about who users are, we can't use client IP addresses. We have to use user IDs. So when we see a user authenticate via one of the protocols, we actually tie their user ID to that session, and then we follow, and we attribute the events in that session to that user ID. With web, basically you look for a successful authentication and then a session cookie, and then you follow the cookie. We also collect contextual information. We'll talk about a little bit what that is, but it's the type of stuff you would see in an employee directory, things that tell you various types of things about the user periodically. And what we do next is we basically find things in that context that uniquely ties to that user, and we build a lookup table where you have the key is the uniquely identifiable piece of information. The value would be a pseudonym for that user. And basically, we would take the information use behavior and anonymize it. This we were required to do just as part of the research and getting the IRB approval to do this work. After anonymization, we only had about 15% of the events were tied to users. This was not nearly enough to be able to begin to see who's doing what. So we had to have a way of attributing additional events to the user. So we basically developed a technique, actually two techniques that basically, based on the same client IP and events occurring before and after the event in question for that client IP address, we were able to infer who the user was, and we ended up being able to attribute about 85% of the events as a result of that. The final thing we did before we had a data set ready for doing some analysis on was what we call segmentation. A lot of times a user does something very simple in the user interface. They do a search on their shared drive for star.doc. Well, what happens is a series of recursive directory lookups based, the number depends on how high up in the directory structure they are and how deep the structure goes. But those are all really one event. So we create meta events to compress those many single events into a single event. So let's talk a little bit about what events are. This table shows you what we're talking about. The column starting from the second on out to the end there below the actions row lists the types of events that you have, things that you would think about that you would do with a file, reads, writes, lists, deletes, moves. We also had events related, printing when you print a file, queries when you submit a search engine query, and then send is sending an email. The purpose for capturing email, who people send email to, was to establish people's social network. What we found we could do is we could tie information to people, and then if we knew who was in someone's social network, we could look for people browsing outside their social network as a possible behavior of interest. So we collected a lot of data. As I said, we did it at MITRE, and we ended up collecting a very large data set. Raw data-wise, it was about 16 terabytes. Packet-wise, about 100 billion. After filtering, that was reduced substantially. And after basically attribution and filtering and anonymization, we ended up with about 64 million events, and that's for about 4,000 users and this is behavior on our internal network only. And this spanned a period of 284 days. Now, of course, one of the challenges here is we don't know ground truth. Was there truly bad people in there? Well, we don't know. But we considered this background data for purposes of doing some testing. So what we needed was to be able to generate some known positives to at least to use with this data, and we'll talk about that in testing in just a second. In terms of context, I just wanted to throw this slide up. This is what I mean by context. It's information about where users are physically located, their job title or role, organizational membership, perhaps projects they work on. We also found that the information metadata can be helpful. We're not talking about document summarization or things like that, but sometimes just simply the path to a file in a shared drive tells you a lot about what organization probably owns that. In fact, the directory structure looks a lot like org charts oftentimes. You can use that kind of data. We also did profile user behavior. We had a number of anomaly detectors that were based on profiling the user's behavior over varying timescales. We not only used the user's individual past behavior, in some cases we used peer comparisons, although we found that a little difficult. In some cases you had to be judicious in that. And we also based their behavior upon comparing to the overall organization's behavior over a period of time. And then finally, the context, some of the easy stuff is organizational norms. It's some low-hanging fruit in terms of things that you can look for. Every organization has things that are not specified in policy, but people generally know you shouldn't probably do it. There's probably certain search terms at every company that you probably shouldn't enter in. Or maybe there's an expectation that people will work during core hours and people will not come in the middle of the night to do interesting things. So let's talk a little bit about going from the events to the alerts. We built 76 different detectors, and these were all based on hypotheses where from reviewing past case studies. Every time there's an insider threat case and there's a legal case brought forth, there is a charging document or indictment. It doesn't go into great detail in terms of what the user did, but it generally gives you enough idea to begin to understand what they must have done to do what they did. We supplemented that with the advice of some domain experts who had been working in this area within MITRE. And we also informed ourselves with the events that the data that we saw in the database. A lot of times we would hypothesize things that we simply found a lot of people did. There was a benign common explanation for that we had to dismiss. Again, these detectors combine activity and context. There's 3 examples there that look for different types of things that we look for. The first one is an example of just violation of organizational norms, maybe terms that you shouldn't be searching on. Excessive printing is an example of where we're using, in this case, we're using, I believe, a folded normal estimator to kind of look for low probability occurrences in terms of their printing behavior based on their past. And this is a volumetric anomaly, another type of indicator that we looked for. And finally, non-local printing. Most people print the printers nearby them. They don't want to walk too far to get to the document. Malicious insiders, if they have coworkers that notice what they print, might not want to print to something that they shouldn't be printing at a printer close by. Why not the printer down the hall, the next floor up? You know, they made a mistake. It's easily explained, but yet it helps them achieve their goal. And there's a lot of permutations to all those different types of things. For all these detectors, we had subject matter experts that basically helped establish the settings. For the detectors and the BaseNet settings as well. The BaseNet itself, we experimented around with a lot of different structures and ultimately settled on a fairly simple structure. At the root node, you have the probability that they're a malicious insider. Beneath that, you have what we call the behavioral layer. And really, these are things where you're thinking about what's the probability they will engage in behavior 1, 2, 3, et cetera, given that they're malicious. Or what's the probability that they engage in it, given that they're not malicious. To populate these conditional probabilities, we basically gathered groups of subject matter experts and elicited from them probabilities to try to get an idea of and sometimes it was quite time consuming and challenging, but they ended up doing a lot better than they thought they would do. And then finally you have the detector layer, and what's the probability of a detector alerting given that the behavior occurred. And this was done with a combination of assumptions in terms of detection and some empirical measurements in terms of false alarm rate. Was there some overlap in terms of how we built, was there strict independence in terms of, Bayes networks, the theory you should have independence between, the nodes? No, there was some dependence, but, we found, we also know that Bayes networks can be somewhat tolerant of that assumption being fudged a little. So what you get out of the Bayes network, you introduce evidence in the form of alerts for each of the detectors, either binary, 1 or 0. What you get out is a threat score between 0 and 1, and what you get is a folded normal, highly skewed distribution that's shown in the graph on the upper right on the graph, view graph. And what you see there are the threat scores sorted from high to low for all the users in the environment monitored, which is about 1,500 users for a day. If you're an analyst, you're very happy now because you see few people with high threat scores, and most people get little to no threat scores. So at least now you have some sense of triage or how to prioritize what you look at. And of course, this is only valid and good if, when you actually have bad people, they show up near the top. So let's talk a little bit about how we tested. As I mentioned, as I said, we don't know ground truth of the background data. So we did make the assumption that the background data had no malicious activity in it. And we basically had a separate team develop a set of scenarios to have red teams run over the period of time during our data collection. They basically looked at open source material on known insider threat cases and then adapted them to our network what would that scenario mean at MITRE. We had a number of different folks of varying seniority at MITRE execute the scenarios using their own accounts. Their data was processed along with the background data. We didn't splice it in or introduce any artifacts into the data set by trying to put stuff in and take stuff out like that. And the other thing I'd mention is that these scenarios were not tightly scripted. You know, first do A, then do B. It was more the red team members were more or less given an objective, general set of rules of behavior, and then told to go ahead in a certain amount of time, and then told to go ahead and try to achieve their objective. During this time, the team developing the approach, the illicit approach, had no knowledge of who was going to do the scenarios, when they were going to do it, nor what they were going to do. In terms of results, we basically elicit, again, scores things from 0 to 1. We set, just for initial detection measurement, the decision threshold at 0.5. And basically there were 19 user days of known bad malicious behavior associated with the red teams. And of those, we detected them above 0.5 on 16 of those days. During that same time, we had about an average of 1,500 users active, and about 23 were also above that 0.5 level. So from there, we were able to get a false alarm rate. The table on the right simply shows for each user that they occurred over a number of days, anywhere from 1 to 5 days. The far left column tells you the scenario, and then you have each day of the activity. These days were not consecutive. There were gaps in between the days, but we just marked them as day 1, day 2, etc. The next column over tells you what their actual threat score was, and then you had the threat rank. And for a lot of the detects, we had them at or near the very top of the list, which was very good. We were very happy with that. Of course, we also looked at why we didn't detect things, and a lot of times either there was certain days the red teams, certain members just didn't do much. There's a certain threshold beneath which you're just not going to be able to generate enough threat score. They didn't do enough things that you would see for you to be able to say much about what they did. There was also sometimes they did things we didn't expect. This is, one of the challenges is building a portfolio that's robust, that can catch them no matter what they do. That's very hard to do in practice, and they were able to find ways. Now they didn't know how we were detecting, but they were able to do things in some cases that we just didn't expect. One of the interesting things is that we looked at our false alarms and what was causing the false alarms, and we noticed that our non-technical admin staff, like our secretaries, office coordinator type people, overwhelmingly generated a lot the false alarms. Does anyone care to venture a guess why? Yeah.
They do stuff on behalf of their supervisor?
Not just one supervisor. They're kind of a funnel. They have multiple people. Hey, can you prepare this information for this? Hey, can you do that? And at least at our company, they get tasked by many people. And so they're constantly working with information, and they're gathering information. From day to day, their activities change, and so they ended up just because of their intensive activity with information combined with gathering information from all parts of the organization, things that were atypical for them, it turned out to generate that generated a lot of false alarms. We feel that these results are a good improvement over a lot of the current practice. The current practice isn't pretty. I mean, a lot of times you have organizations randomly selecting users to audit their behavior. Maybe slightly better would be auditing based on the volume of activity, if you believe that that's correlated to maliciousness. We found with a lot of our we found with our behavior that threat scores in general, we actually did a correlation measurement of threat score versus the number of events for 2 months during which the red teams were active, and there was there's no correlation. So I'm going to talk really quick now about some additional research we did, because we felt that we had some promising results with the initial work, but there were some open questions. We obviously didn't discover all the possible things malicious insiders could do. We were also interested in exploring, we had looked at things from a network perspective. We wanted to see what you could see in addition from a host-based perspective. And finally, we also wanted to look at the human factors side of things. So what we put together was a multidisciplinary team. We had some behavioral psychologists, Deanna Caputo, and then some computer scientists form a team. And we really, what the whole idea was, look, if you have two groups of users, they're going after the same information under the same circumstances, there's simply a different motivation, one being benign, one being malicious, would that cause them to behave in statistically meaningful, ways that are different and statistically meaningful? So that was kind of the idea there. And our main hypotheses, again, were, we thought that malicious users would gather information in similar patterns, benign users would gather information in similar patterns, and these patterns would be different. It's a bad analogy, but it's kind of, you kind of have rats in a maze. They're put in two different parts of the maze, and I don't want to compare our employees to rats, but the cheese is the information. Do they take different pathways based on where they're put into the maze, and are they predictable paths? So we actually kind of borrowed the design from what the types of things they tend to do with experiments in psychology, in social science in general. We basically created a double-blind procedure where the participants, as far as they knew, were testing some kind of heuristic-based anti-key logging software, and we had to go to elaborate depths to actually make them believe that. This experiment involved handing them a laptop, and they had to calibrate the keylogger when they first got on. And of course, if they looked up the processes, they would see a keylogger.exe. And we had to do all sorts of manner sleight of hand to convince users that this was really about anti-key logging. What it was really about was testing the differences in behavior. So basically, we had two conditions and about the same number of participants that participated. One benign, the control group, and then the malicious. As I said, everything was kept the same. The scope that they were looking for information on a topic. Basically, the topic was biosecurity, and they basically their environment was the same, and they had the same amount of time, which was 1 week, and the only thing was different was their intent or motivation, which we manipulated using scenarios. What we had to tell them was, look, I know anti-key logging is not an exciting thing to test, so let me give you a role to play to at least make you get a little more into it. And this is an important thing, because if they don't get into the role, this is not an effective experiment. So this was really important to take a lot of time to get this right in terms of getting them into their role. In terms of participant selection, we tried to stratify by their cumulative job experience at MITRE. So we wanted everything from the junior folks, and I think the youngest person we had was like 20. The oldest person was like 72 and had been there like 40 years at MITRE. So very broad, very diverse group of people, and trying to go for a more generalizable result. In terms of the procedure itself, we basically again, everything started with recruitment. Part of the double blind is not only not letting the participants know what the purpose is, but we had a proctor that also did not know what our core hypotheses and the central elements of the research was. They simply had a script that they were following, so we had to hire someone specifically for this. So the proctor was in charge of recruiting, and through a variety of techniques, we were able to recruit across the organization and get people to participate in this, which was difficult because you're asking for a week of someone's time. So we had to do the usual consent forms, rules of behavior. They couldn't hack MITRE's network. We gave them a pre-questionnaire, which was really just for them to fill out biographical information about themselves. And again, all this data was anonymized, and we had to go through the MERB to get this approved. And one of the things, at the very end, we gave them the scenario, and we told them when we gave them the laptop that they would actually be graded. This was a graded assignment. We would have subject matter experts in biosecurity actually evaluate how well they did. We were trying, in essence, to create a performance demand so that they would actually not only fulfill the role in terms of the scenario, but the task that was assigned them, the information that they were supposed to go after. So they basically had, we gave them basically 10 hours over 7 days that they could accomplish what they did. Now, one artificiality we had to introduce because we couldn't really have internal MITRE data going outside of the organization was they were to deliver everything that they built onto a CD. Now, if you're an insider threat person, you're saying, well, that you've just eliminated anything that's exfiltration related. We understood that, but there was limits to what we could do safely and get approval for to do. On the laptop, we did a bunch of different monitoring. We had the network monitoring from the illicit work, but we also used a commercial data loss prevention, a host-based data loss prevention product called Vertices, which basically monitors everything, how people interact with information, clipboard activity, file manipulation local to the machine, moving stuff onto removable magnetic media like USB flash drives, things like that. All that stuff that we never would see from the host space or from the network perspective. So they were basically given a week. At the end of that, they would turn in the laptop. We basically had the proctor do a debriefing of them for the purpose to try to ask questions to kind of understand did they follow the role, did they do the task, and furthermore, what did they think the hypothesis of the work was? If one of them did yes, they just happened to go to a seminar on insider threat, and then they happened to, guess what, get the malicious condition, and they figured it out, and so we had to drop them. We also did a post questionnaire where we were trying to ask them increasingly in-depth questions to try to get them to get inside their head in terms of what they were thinking, how did they approach their task, in order to just get some non-cyber observable human factors analysis into this work. Finally, we did have them do a personality assessment, NEO, 4 factors, I believe, FFI. And finally, we handed the data that they gave us on to some subject matter experts and had 2 of them evaluate the work. So we were able to compare, use that data as well. So what do we do with before we go into that, let's talk about the scenarios. Again, this is what we use to manipulate their intent. In the malicious case, you basically have the scenario is in both scenarios, they've fallen on hard times financially. And in this case, the user, the insider goes looking externally for a new job. And boy, they find a new job, but it's contingent upon them taking information from their existing employer with them to their new employer. Not that that would ever happen. And so, basically how good their signing bonus is directly correlated to the quality of the information that they hand. And the scenario, to make it realistic, is you've got a competition, an acquisition, and you've got one of the vendors that is in that acquisition is one of the vendors is asking for insider information about that acquisition that we would have on that. So it was a fairly realistic scenario. In the benign case, you've got the same situation in terms of participants been fallen on hard times. In this case, they've been asked to participate on a high-profile team, and if they do a good job on this team, they're going to probably get a promotion, and so they're a member of the team. And we went to pretty extreme lengths. We had a number of people review what we did to perfectly balance these scenarios down to the exact words, so that, not word count, but in terms of really, we were paying particular attention to how we worded everything to make sure that they were as balanced as possible. So did this work? So first before we even care about the data, did people get into the role? If they didn't get into the role, the data really is not much use. So one way we tried to measure that was through this subject matter expert evaluation of what they collected. I mean, the idea is, okay, well, in terms of the task, did they perform the same? And when we actually had two people evaluate, we got good high iterative reliability between the two, and we found no statistically significant difference between the two groups. So that's good. They performed the task the same. Now the next question is, well, did they get into their roles? Were they being method actors, or were they just doing their job? Well, in some cases we had a few people that were clearly not getting into the role, which they basically had to be dropped because they just weren't following instructions of the study. In other cases, they got into it too much. In some cases, we had people refuse to do it. They said, I can't do this in good conscience. I will feel guilty. Other people really got into it and did it. And then other people did it and would search for things like whistleblower, search terms like that. They were trying to do everything they could to how to get out of their financial situation versus actually going after the information because they didn't want to do it. So we had those kinds of things too. But of the people who did actually engage in the role and complete the task, in the post survey, we found that they were definitely they were answering questions in a way that was indicating that they were definitely acting very differently from how they're used to behaving. They did lots of things to try to be secretive, physical things, including closing doors. Unfortunately, now those aren't cyber detectable. The admins love to put screen protectors on. All the administrative people at MITRE do that, and you can't really quite see what they're doing unless you're right behind them. Unfortunately, not cyber detectable. But they also gave innocuous folder names. One person got so into it, they actually typed, not when they were in the malicious condition, that they actually typed up a resignation letter and gave it to the proctor along with the material that they collected. So people were clearly getting into it, and similarly, the people who were in the benign condition were definitely getting into their role as well. So what were some of the differences? Well, first of all, we definitely saw statistical differences in terms of evasiveness. The malicious people didn't want to get caught. We saw a big difference in terms of the number of sessions they used. They tend to break up their collection into a lot more sessions during the day, perhaps just looking for windows of opportunity. The benign group condition tended to be a little more continuous in terms of longer periods of time, fewer login sessions. We also saw an interesting phenomenon where the malicious group would, rather than, we have an internal search appliance, a Google search appliance, and rather than click on the links based on the search, they would click on the cached results, so that they didn't reach out and actually touch the owner's information directly. It would be the Google spider that would go out and do that, as a way to kind of just be a little more sneaky and not actually have to alert the information owner that they're accessing the information, which was kind of interesting. We also found that they tended to take an indirect way of getting at the information, whereas the benign people would tend to just do Google searches and go right to the information. The malicious group tended to look up people in the employee locator, find out who they were, who was associated with projects that might be of interest, and then they started browsing their shared space. That person in MITRE, everyone has shared space that everyone else can get to, and they kind of went to get at the information directly versus indirectly versus searching and then just directly grabbing data, which we thought was kind of an interesting thing. We also saw kind of a difference in terms of quality over quantity. The malicious users really were really focused on just collecting the information. They weren't trying to synthesize or organize it, whereas the benign users were definitely trying to make some sense out of it. it was kind of, maybe the malicious group was looking at, they were getting paid by the byte or something. I don't know, but they definitely weren't so interested. The idea was, if I collect a whole bunch of information, something in here has to be of value, and I don't want to spend the time or take the risk of really looking at this data too much. Just get it and get out. And similarly, there's this notion of grab and go, which by that we're kind of talking about bursty behavior, looking for windows of opportunity. The malicious group tended to be very bursty, grab things really quick when there's a window of opportunity, whereas the benign group would just be more steady state, kind of, they open a document, look at it, try to understand it, synthesize it, maybe go to the next document. The malicious people were just taking windows of opportunity quickly, gathering the information, and then maybe there would be a lull, and then there'd be another burst over time. We saw that both with what they downloaded and what they searched on. One of the interesting things that we did was we actually searched, we actually asked in the post-survey the participants, we basically drew up a list of what are the typical things that companies do to countermeasures for insider threat. We basically asked the users, well, to what degree would, and this was one of the last questions we asked them because it's a little more revealing, but to what degree do these security mechanisms, would it have affected how they behaved? And we did it for the malicious and benign group. And the things that we were looking at for those of you remotely were things like, well, document headers and footers indicating proprietary material. Another one would be pop-up warnings indicating, hey, you're being monitored. Awareness that there's monitoring software on your computer was yet another one. Signing a confidentiality agreement. Being in a public environment while using the laptop. There's a general one that we call just security policy, awareness of there being security policy related to using appropriate use of information. Signing ethics agreements was yet another one. Knowledge of recent violations where people were caught in terms of insider threat was one, and then finally mandatory training. A couple things were interesting. One was the thing that everybody does across the groups was rated the lowest, which was the mandatory training. That's actually, this isn't a conclusive study or anything like that, but it does kind of raise the question of how effective are these things that organizations are doing. I mean, if training is not effective, or do we know how effective it is? I think there's a lot of unanswered questions here that further research could potentially elicit some interesting answers to. The things that ended up being the statistically significant differences were pop-up warnings indicating that you're being monitored. Malicious were much more likely to say that would have affected them. Awareness of monitoring software, that kind of makes sense. And then knowledge of recent information use violations. All those have potential policy implications in terms of how organizations might want to address the insider threat. So we learned a lot of things from this study. One of the things that was really important was, particularly when you're dealing with a human experiment type of study, is you get only one chance to do it right, and you don't want to find out halfway through that that your protocol was flawed, and there's people were not engaging with their roles. So we did do a lot of piloting of the design before we actually did the experiment, and we found there were some additional things that we had to do to really get them into the role and make sure that they understood their task. There was some, I think we did about 5 or 6 different dry runs before we actually started collecting data. Of course, in our case, the handing out of a laptop, a special purpose laptop, kind of was an artificiality and the fact that they had to deliver the information on CD introduced some artificialities. The problem with the laptop was they did their work for the experiment on one laptop, and then if they had, one of the things we hypothesized is that they would interleave benign and malicious behavior. Well, they did. They did it on 2 different machines, only one of which we were monitoring. At least anecdotally, that was the answer that we got. That was in an ideal world, you would have one laptop for them to do everything, but from a logistical standpoint, we just couldn't do that. Also, in terms of the data analysis, we really, especially with host-based monitoring, we had a very difficult time in separating out what is the user's behavior versus what is the operating system doing on behalf of, or the application doing on behalf of the user. We thought, for example, some of the things that users would do, well, after they do bad stuff, if they're in a malicious condition, they'll delete their cache, they'll remove their history, they'll clear out their cookies. Well, we saw the first two. The cookies, the problem was it was impossible to separate out what the browser is doing as part of its daily maintenance and upkeep. It's actually more than daily, it's constant upkeep versus what was a user-initiated delete of their cookies. And then you have all sorts of stuff, weird stuff with Microsoft Office. It creates temp files all the time and moves stuff around. You open up a PowerPoint file and all the objects in there get blown up into Windows meta files or enhanced meta files in a Windows temp directory. All that looks like file opens, file creations, and it sometimes can be very difficult to separate, tweeze out the human from the machine behavior, but we did spend a lot of time doing that. The other thing is that the host-based monitoring was really nice, but there were some gaps. Another thing we hypothesized would be interesting that malicious users might do is that they might interleave their behavior, but do it not only with you can do it certainly. Okay, you can do it time of good behavior, time of bad behavior, or you can do the behavior at the same time using different browser windows or simply separate tabs. But unfortunately, with the host-based monitoring, you can't differentiate different process, different windows or different tabs within the same browser. So we couldn't really tell whether they were doing that or not. And then other simple things like we thought searching within a web page would be kind of an interesting thing to see. It's yet another way of focusing down on the information and telling us what they're really interested in trying to get at. But we couldn't observe that. We did feed that information back to the vendor, and we believe they said they would look at trying to address those feature requests. In terms of the data loss, DLP is data loss prevention. That's the host-based monitoring type of host-based monitoring product we used. We also found that out of the box, they tend to filter a lot of data simply because they can't deal with everything that happens. They don't have good analytic techniques for reducing down things for the analyst. So we had to unfilter a lot of stuff that came out of the box in order to see the kinds of things that we need. And finally, one of the things we realized is that, getting back to our central hypotheses, were people predictable in their paths? Well, it really came down to individual users. There were things that were statistically different between the control and the experiment group, but down to the individual, it's hard to predict. If you only look for these three things, you'll detect all the malicious people. In terms of the predictiveness within their group of doing certain things, we found that there's just the human factor. People just do things. They may engage in some of the malicious behaviors that you think you'll see, but they won't predictably engage in just a subset of the ones that you think about. So we think you probably need to, this tells us is that you do need to try to cast a wider net of indicators, which is kind of what we were trying to do with the initial illicit work was if you have a way of combining evidence and prioritizing things, you can cast a wider net of indicators in terms of things that you look at. That's really it. We have a number of papers that go into the research, both the initial internal illicit work as well as the work that we did under the Institute for Information Infrastructure Protection. And a summary of all this work is actually in the November edition of IEEE Security and Privacy magazine. There's an article that summarizes all this work. for more information. So, subject to your questions, I don't know where we are in time.
Well, right about at the end, we'll probably take a question. We've got a short one. Remember to press the button on your microphone.
It's okay, no pressure. It's been a long day for me.
Well, if you'd like to chat afterwards, you can.
Yeah,
do that as well.
I welcome that. I'm, we do a lot of interesting research at MITRE. If there's any interest, we're actually taking this a step further and applying it to, okay, we might detect when malicious insiders operate outside their normal behaviors. Can we now take this and use a similar approach for masquerade detection? You have someone who's now broken into your network. They don't know what normal is for the account, but you're paying pretty close attention to how people normally behave. Can you now detect, we believe there's a detection window of opportunity until they learn what normal is. So we're pursuing that right now. We're in the early phases. But I am looking for people who are interested in working that. So thank you for your time.